Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel of the Lord.
Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents an inspiring gospel reflection by Father Michael Sparrow. Father Michael is a Jesuit priest working as a writer and retreat master at the Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House outside Chicago.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus entered the synagogue. There was a man there with a withered hand. They watched Jesus closely to see if he would cure on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up here before us." Then he said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil? To save life rather than destroy it?" But they remained silent, looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart. Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately took counsel with the Herodians against him to put him to death. The Gospel of the Lord. Today's Gospel is from Mark chapter 3, and there are a number of details in this story that are rather extraordinary. The ordinariness of the story is that Jesus is once again involved in a skirmish over the interpretation of the law with the Pharisees. Remember, the Pharisees were the experts in interpreting the law. They were the religious teachers, the religious elite. They knew the law backwards and forwards, and they prided themselves on scrupulously observing it. And of course, the law of the Sabbath said no work on the Sabbath. So they come into the situation, they know that Jesus is a preacher, teacher, exorcist, that he has many people following him, and so they come to the synagogue specifically to try and catch him. Why are they so upset? Because they see Jesus as a lawbreaker. And indeed, Jesus gives them fuel for their anger today. He cures on the Sabbath. The detail that's interesting in Mark's account of this particular scene is that Jesus is angry. He's angry at what? He's angry at their hard-heartedness. Jesus, who is compassion itself, Jesus, who is love itself, is angry because of the stubbornness and the obstinacy of the people. I would call this tough love. Sometimes love is tender, sometimes it's compassionate, sometimes it just sits and weeps. Sometimes love is infinitely patient. And sometimes love calls a spade, and that's one of the things that Jesus does today. He's grieved at their hardness of heart and their obstinacy because the Pharisees are so darn assured that they're right and Jesus is wrong. There's no room for dialogue there. They know they're the experts. This upstart preacher is not. So just shut up and do what we say and everything will be fine. That's the Pharisees' position. Jesus' healing is a healing of compassion. Here's a man with a withered hand. In that society where there's no social net, there's no social security, there's no retirement benefits, and if you have a withered hand, you can't work. You're condemned to a life of begging. There's no other option. Jesus' miracle healing is an act of compassion to give the man his life back. The Pharisees don't care about him. They care about the law. Why did they study the law when they were young. Obviously, they had some religious experience that deeply touched their hearts, that drew them to want to study God's law day and night, to meditate on it. But something happened. Gradually over time, their hearts became hardened. They forgot why they had entered into the ministry of religion. It became a business. It became a livelihood. It became a power struggle. It became us against them. It wasn't about mercy. It wasn't about compassion. It was about, we're right, you're wrong. We got the power. We're the authority figures. Do what we say. Their hearts were hardened. Sometimes we get really frightened of God when we talk about God's anger. But I think when we understand God's anger, this chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 in Mark helps us understand what the Bible is talking about when it talks about the anger of God. It's not anger at people who fall into sin, who are trying to do the right thing. It's anger at people who are so darn assured that they got it right, that there's no room for anybody else, including God. God, if you would just be quiet and let me do it, I'll run this universe just fine, okay? Jesus' response to that is, and so the man with the withered, here's what's extraordinary about the man with the withered hand doesn't even ask to be healed. He doesn't even say he believes. There's no dialogue. It's a pure act of mercy on Jesus' part and a demonstration of his power. And what's the reaction on the part of the Pharisees? Their anger erupts into fury to the point where they want to kill him. And Mark adds in the closing line, they plot with the Herodians. What's so interesting about that? The Herodians were their dead enemies. They sided with Herod, and they could care less. The Herodians could care less about the law. They were in collusion with the Romans. It was all about secular power. And here you've got very strange bedfellows united in their hatred of Jesus. They hate him for different reasons, but they both hate him. Now here's the difference between Jesus' anger and the anger of the Pharisees. Jesus' anger moves him to healing and compassion and to confront very directly the sin of the Pharisees. It's nonviolent, it's standing in his truth, it's merciful, but the emotion is anger. How does that differ from the Pharisees? They go out, they plot with their enemies, and they want to put them to death. It's a violent response. Does this have anything to do with us today? Can we empathize? Is there a bit of the Pharisee in you? I can see there's a bit of the Pharisee in me, where our hearts harden. And it's not about doing the right thing. It's about us being right. Have you ever been involved in an argument where you can't even remember what you're arguing about, but you just want to prove that you're right? There's a debate raging in the Catholic Church right now over Pope Francis's latest apostolic discourse, The Joy of Love, Laetitia Amoris. Because, why? In that apostolic discourse, Pope Francis has introduced a dialogue. He says that human relationships are very complex and there's no set of laws that can totally encompass the complexity of that love. And they need to be discerned. And there has to be room for a pastoral response of the congregation meeting with their pastor, helping them form their conscience and decide, what do I need to do? And the case in point, the hot button issue, are those who have been divorced and remarried and been in that situation 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and the law says they cannot approach the sacraments. Pope Francis says, we need to do something about that. These are people who are living outside the law, but they're stable and they're loving. Should they not be able to discern a way of being able to return to the sacraments for whatever reason, and there are a multitude of reasons why they can't get an annulment? And the hardliners of the church, 4 cardinals, canon lawyers, ethicists, many are pushing back and saying, this is heresy. I think the Pope should be publicly corrected. And what did the hardliners do? In an unprecedented movement, they exposed the debate public. They leaked it to the press. So the dialogue becomes very public. What's at the heart of this? The heart of it is, what's the purpose of the law? If the answer is the law, then there's no room for dialogue. It's the Sabbath. You don't do work on the Sabbath. Too bad he's got a withered hand. Tell him to come back tomorrow. Can't you cure him tomorrow? That's the Pharisees' answer. Well, I'm sorry they're divorced and remarried, but if they had made a better choice in the first place, they wouldn't be in this predicament, and it's their own darn fault. And if they really care about it, then have them get an annulment. If they can't get an annulment, then offer it up in sacrifice. End of debate. Pope Francis says, wait a minute. It's more complex than that. Do you have any of your children who struggle with addiction or mental illness? Do you have family members who struggle with addiction? Have you struggled with it yourself? If you do, then you know how hard it is to decide what's the loving thing to do. How do I love these people? Sometimes what's needed is tough love. And sometimes what's needed is to weep with them in the brokenness of their lives. Do you have family members who are gay? It's really easy to be very tough and very clear on these issues when it doesn't affect you. But when it's your daughter, or it's your son, or it's you, that's a horse of a different color. It's easy to talk about them Muslims, those dangerous refugees. But when you meet them and you hear their story, it becomes much more complex and much more difficult to just shut the door and say, go away. When you see their child starving, their wife weeping, the man humiliated because they've lost everything. It's a whole lot harder to just say, not in my house. For me, these are the kinds of questions that today's gospel raises. And they're questions. But to enter into the dialogue, to be willing to ask the question, what does love require? Is to enter into the human condition. And I think Pope Francis raises those questions because he's lived with the poor. He walks the streets of Buenos Aires as he walks the streets of Rome. And when you meet with these people and you see them and you love them, then your first concern is not what the law says, it's how do I help them? There was no room in the Pharisees' heart for that dialogue. What's the room in our hearts? What's the room in my heart? What's the room in your heart? I'll be honest, I don't want to go there. It's just much easier to have black and white answers. It's clear, because that's not messy, it's clean. Life is messy. Is your life clean, clear-cut? Mine isn't. These are the difficult questions that are raised, and these are the questions that draw me back here day after day, year after year. praying my heart doesn't become hardened. Because it's a whole lot easier to walk around with a hardened heart, because then you don't care. Then you don't get hurt. Then we live in our own smug little bubble of assurance. Pope Francis is calling us to something else, because Jesus is calling us to something else. Amen.
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel